Right. Hello there, and welcome to the first of the statistics side of the AS level course. Today, we are going to be looking at sampling. So our objectives for today is we're going to understand what the terms population, sample, and census means, and we're going to discuss the advantages and disadvantages of each. We're going to understand the advantages and disadvantages of these different sampling methods. So simple random sampling, systematic sampling, stratified sampling, quota, and opportunity sampling. To start off with for today, please could you have a look at the following key terms and match them up with the correct definitions. If you press pause and then unpause when you're ready to have a look at the answers. Okay, so let's run through these. So here are the pairs that you should have matched up. We'll start off with population. The population is the whole group. So everything that you want to investigate in a statistical test. So that could be, everybody in a certain town or a city. It could be everybody in a school. It's not necessarily the population of the entire country. It's all dependent on what you're looking at. Following on from that, we then have sample. Sample is the selection of members from the population. So you extract a number of people or a number of items from a population, and that becomes your sample. A survey, so we're going to skip to the third one. A survey is a way of collecting information about a population. So you ask them a question, they give you an answer, and you collect the data from everyone and then draw conclusions from it. A hypothesis is what you start off with. It's an unproven statement which will then be tested. So it could be, for example, on average, boys are taller than girls. That's not necessarily going to be true, but it's something that you state at the beginning. You then collect data to test that and then draw a conclusion as to whether or not your hypothesis was true. So let's now have a look at census versus a sample. So we've already talked about population. So here we've got a population. And in this example, we're looking at all students in a school. So this is everybody in the school. So that's our population. A census is a survey which information is taken from every single member of the population. So everyone in the school is asked a question and data is collected from everybody. Now, what we could do instead is select a number of people from the population. So we've just extracted 6 students and we are now going to ask them a question instead of everybody. That is what we call a sample. So it's a selection of members from a population. Information is used from the sample and is used to deduce information about the population. So what we're saying here is whatever conclusions we draw about this sample, we are assuming that conclusion applies to the whole population. Now you can already start to think about why that, the pros and cons of that, which is why the sampling method you choose is quite important, and we have to get it right. Now, each individual student in our sample is called a sampling unit. And the population in which we have chosen from is called the sampling frame. So all the students in the school is our sampling frame. From that, we've taken a sample, and each student in the sample is called a sampling unit. So there's a lot of definitions here. So what I would suggest is hit pause, take the notes so that you've got all this written down so that you can refer back to it. Let's now look at the advantages and disadvantages of each. And again, I would highly recommend writing this all down. It's a lot of theory today, but we'll get through that and then we'll move on to all the number crunching in later lessons. So a census. So remember, this is when we ask every member of the population a question. and collect data on that. The advantages of a census is that, of course, the results will be accurate because everybody's results are included in it. However, it can be expensive and it can be time consuming. It can be difficult to process large volumes of data. So imagine trying to work out averages of, large quantities of data, and all those calculations of putting it all into graphs in order to analyze and compare things. When you've got lots of data, it makes that more of a difficult process. It also cannot be used when testing destroys the item. So what that means is, if you want to say, for example, we're testing the life of batteries, in order to do that, we are using the battery until it dies to test how long it was working for. If we do that with every single battery that a factory produces, there'll be no more batteries to sell. So we cannot use a census in that instance for a scenario like that. So we have to use a sample. Now, moving on to a sample, the advantages will be the opposite of the disadvantages of a census, essentially. It's cheaper and it's less time consuming because you're only testing a sample number of items or people. We need less people to respond. So if we were to ask everyone in a town a question, some people might opt out from answering. So the advantage of a sample is that if someone opts out, we just move on to somebody else and we will still have the number of people in our sample. We have less data to process, so it's more straightforward and less complex. Now, the disadvantages of a sample is that the data may not be as accurate. And also, the sample may not be representative enough. Now, we'll talk about representation a lot more when we look at stratified sampling. But essentially, what that means is if we have a population which is split into a demographic in certain proportions, what we want is for our sample to also have the same proportion of those demographics. Otherwise, it's not representing the population well enough. So we're now going to look at sampling methods. So there's a number of sampling methods. We're going to discuss what they are and the advantages and the disadvantages of each one. So the advantages of simple random sampling is where we take the population, we assign everyone a unique number, and then we use a random number generator to select units for the sample. Now, we could use a random number generator on a calculator, we could use it on the computer. There's lots of random number generator softwares and, websites and stuff out there. But essentially what it is that it's not a person choosing the numbers, it's a machine or a computer or a calculator. And that removes subjectivity from a human. The advantages is that there isn't any bias. So a human could sway towards certain numbers or certain types of people. It's simple and cost effective to carry out for small samples. Everyone either has access to some sort of internet or computer or a calculator. And each sampling unit has an equal chance of being selected. So it's very fair. However, the disadvantage is if the population is large or when the intended sample size is large, it can be quite difficult. You're producing a large sample. And we do need a defined sampling frame. And what that means is we need to know where we're selecting from and everyone who's included in that. So an example where that might be difficult is if you're trying to select a sample of fish in a lake. They swim around, very unsystematically. So it's very hard to define where the sampling frame is when you've got a scenario like that. The next one is called systematic sampling. And this is when the required elements are chosen at regular intervals from an ordered list. So what we do is, for example, if I have a population of 120 and I know I want a sample size of 30, what I will do is do 120 divided by 30, and that gives me 4. So I'm going to choose every fourth person. Now, I don't necessarily need to start from person number 1. I could start from person number 2. Yeah, but as long as I choose the next fourth person on from there, so the 6th, and then 4 more will give me the 10th and the 14th, etc. As long as from wherever you started, you choose the fourth person every thereafter. Now, the advantages is that it is suitable for large populations and large sample sizes because it makes it really straightforward to select. It is simple and it's cost effective, just like random sampling. The disadvantage is there is a possibility of bias if the sampling frame is not suitable. And again, same with random sampling, a sampling frame would be needed. Stratified sampling. This is the most complicated way of sampling, but it is the one that's going to produce you the most accurate results in terms of representation. This is when the proportion of demographics within a population is represented in the sample. So, for example, if I have a school with a population of 1,000, and within that school there are 600 boys and 400 girls. This means that 60% of the school are boys, 40% of the school are girls. What I would like then in my sample, which is going to be 40, sample size of 40, I want 60% of that to be boys and 40% of that to be girls. So I've calculated here that 60 over 1,000 is my 60%, times that by 40, that gives me 24. So 24 boys need to be in my sample. And likewise with the girls, 400 over 1,000 is my 40%. Times that by the 40 gives me 16. So 16 girls need to be in the sample. What I then do is I then number all the boys, from 1 to 600, number all the girls from 1 to 400, and use a random number generator to select 24 boys and then select 16 girls. Here the sample is representative of the population structure and the demographics are represented accurately. So if there's any results or anything I'm testing that might be dependent on gender, then at least my representation means that my result is therefore accurate. The disadvantages is that classifying the population into strata is needed before the sampling process. So I need to define who the boys are, who the girls are, and do a little bit of prep work before actually carrying out my sample selection. It is more complex and more time consuming. There are some calculations involved, and it can be difficult and time consuming with large populations or large sample sizes. So it's a matter of a trade-off between, what's more important? Is accuracy what you're aiming for, or is it just speed and efficiency? And it's up to the person carrying out this experiment to decide that, but also to be aware of the limitations of each. Here now we've got some non-random sampling. So we've got quota sampling. Quota is when we divide the population into predefined groups. We survey people and allocate them to the appropriate group. And when that group is full, we just ignore any further people from that group. We disregard their data and move on to the next one. The advantages are that the small sample can still be representative of the population because we are disregarding people that we no longer need. We don't need a sampling frame for this. We are literally just walking around asking people questions. It's cheap, quick and easy, and we can compare different groups within a population because we've split them into their different demographics. The disadvantages are that it is non-random, so there could be bias. A person is walking around and choosing who to speak to. Population needs to be divided into groups before the survey is carried out, so there is a bit of prep work in advance of carrying out this survey. Increasing groups adds time and expense. So the more demographic groups you are including, the longer and more complicated the process is going to be. And there could be non-responders. There could be people who say, no, thank you, I don't wish to give you any information. And you just have, and that can make the process longer, more difficult. Another one is opportunity or convenience sampling. So this is where you take a sample from people who are available at the time of the study and who fit the criteria you're looking for. So for example, it could be that you stand outside the train station and ask the first 30 people. This is cheap and it's easy, but however, it's not representative, and researcher bias on is based on where the survey is carried out. So if I was trying to if my hypothesis was that people prefer to take the train to work, so then I stand outside the train station and ask 30 people, what method of transport do they prefer to get to work? Well, that's clearly going to be biased towards the result of people saying, I prefer to take the train. So that's not the ideal way to carry out that experiment. I should really stand in multiple locations and ask people that way. So I've done a lot of talking. Here are 4 questions for you to consider. What I would like you to do is have a read of that, see if you can answer those, press pause, have a go at that, and then I will go through the answers with you shortly. Okay, hopefully you've given yourself plenty of time to do that. Let's go through these answers. So the first question was, you wish to find out the favourite chocolate of students in a school, and there's 1,000 students in the school. So how would you take a census? Well, a census would be to collect data from every member of the population. So ask all 1,000 students what their favourite chocolate is. Describe how to take a sample size of 40 using simple random sampling. Hopefully you said that we assign all the students in the school a number from 1 to 1,000. We use a random number generator to generate 40 numbers, and the student with that assigned number is in the sample. If we have repeat numbers, we just disregard it. So for example, if number 25 came up twice, we just disregard it the second time and just pick another one. Give one argument for using a census and one for using a sample. You may have written a bit more detail than this, but to simply put it, census ensures accuracy and sample is quicker. You might have said sample is cheaper or easier, as long as it's relating to the advantages and disadvantages that we've discussed earlier. A systematic sample is used to find a sample from a population of 3,783 people. A random number between 1 to 13 is generated, and that numbered member of the population and every 13th member thereafter is selected for the sample. How large was the sample? So hopefully you got 291. So what we would normally do is the population, which is 3,783. We would divide that by the sample size, let's call that X at the moment, and that has given them 13. That's how they know they're selecting every 13th member. So if I just do a little bit of rearranging now, and divide through by my 13, and that's how we're getting our 291, and over here, that's what they've done. So the sample size must have been 291. Third question, manufacture of light bulbs produces 2,772 coloured light bulbs in a day, amongst which are 1,001 red, 1,309 blue and 462 green. 36 bulbs are chosen to test their lifetime. So our sample size is 36. How much of each colour bulbs are chosen if a stratified sample is taken? So you can see there that they are finding the proportion of red, blue and green respectively, and then timesing it by the sample size of 36. So 1,001 is red out of 2,772 in total. That will give you the proportion, times it by 36. 13 in our sample have to be red, 17 have to be blue, and 6 have to be green. Explain why it's not appropriate to take a census. Or if we test all the light bulbs until they die, that would mean all light bulbs would be damaged in the process. The manufacturer would have no more light bulbs to sell. And finally, Mel thinks that most people watch her favourite television programme. So that's our hypothesis. She thinks most people like the television programme she likes. She asks 20 of her friends whether they watch the television programme. She's used convenience sampling because it's convenient. There are 20 of her friends already. She knows them. They're conveniently located to her. She can just pick up the phone or send them a message, and she's got her data. Now, why is this sample biased? As long as you said something along the lines of she's only asked her friends are likely to have the same interests as her. So it's highly likely that they also watch the same television programs as her. It could be that her friends are similar age to her, so they have the same interest in television programs, or as if she'd asked someone very much younger or very much older, they might have said different TV programs. So she's done it in a very biased way. Okay, so that was very, very theory based. And a lot of the content that you've learnt today is very likely to be like a part D, like a one marker to longer questions where they say, give the type of sampling method that's been used or give a limitation of the sampling methods that's been used. But it's very important to understand the theory behind all of this so that we are picking up those marks and not losing out on, one mark here and there. Here are the textbook activities based on what exam board you are doing. If you are doing the AQA route, don't do question 5 yet because we haven't yet covered the content for that. So if you could just have a go at these activities and just get yourself ready for the content for week 2.